morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I want to talk to you about how your wages are calculated for a Florida workers' compensation case. So your wages are determined by what's called your average weekly wage. And your average weekly wage is essentially an average of the 13 weeks of your gross earnings for the 13 weeks before the accident and not including the week of the accident. So what does that mean? So gross earnings is the amount of money you make before taxes and all the deductions are taken out. So it's gross earnings, and then you look at a calendar and you say, okay, the accident happened on, a Wednesday, and then the first week that you'll count will be the week before that week, and then you'll go back again. So you take those 13 weeks of the gross earnings, and then you add them together, and then you divide by 13. That gives you the average weekly wage. Now, there's some other things that could included called fringe benefits. The main one that usually gets included is health insurance. So if in most situations, employer provided health insurance, they're paying part of your premium, and then the employee's paying a part of it. So that employer provided portion that gets included in that average. So you got to put for each each week what the amount of the premium is, and then you add that and the wages and divide by 13, and that would give you the average weekly wage. There's some other kinds of fringe benefits that are included. They're not as common, but it could be housing and things like that. So that's the average weekly wage. Now, then you might ask, okay, well, what happens if I didn't work for the 13 weeks? Like there's tons of examples of people that are getting hurt, the first week on the job or even the first day on the job. It happens all the time. Well, the rule is that method that I just described to you is acceptable, assuming the worker worked 75% of their customary hours. And that would just mean 75% of 13 weeks. So in other words, it's okay if a week or two are missing, but if there's too much missing, if it's like half of it is missing, then we can't do that method. We got to think of something else. And so the other two methods that you look at is what's called contract of hire. And contract of hire means like, what were you supposed to make? So contract of hire, let's say, for example, you're supposed to make $20 an hour and work 40 hours a week. Then you would just take 40 times 20, and that would be your average weekly wage. And then obviously if it's a salary, then you would just take the salary divided by 52 weeks, so you get a weekly portion of the salary, and then that's your average weekly wage. The other method is called similar employee. So you look at an employee that has sort of maybe the same job title, same responsibilities, all of those things, and you do basically that same calculation of the 13 weeks divided by 13 with the other employee, and then you use that for the one who got hurt. So that's, in a general sense, how average weekly wage is calculated. Now, it's important to note that that's not actually what you get paid. In most cases, it's about, I would say it's without getting too much into the weeds, it's about 2/3 of your average weekly wage. So if your average weekly wage ends up being $1,000 a week, what you would actually get paid is like, let's say $666 a week. And that would come like every 2 weeks, sort of like a paycheck for so long as you are on a disability and you are not being offered a job within your restrictions from the employer. Now, there's some instances where your average weekly wage can actually be changed. And so when someone is, when we're talking about those fringe benefits, so long as those are still being paid by the employer, they actually don't get included in the average weekly wage, because but they do if the person gets fired. So you could have an average weekly wage with just your salary, and then you get fired, and then the fringe benefits get upward adjusted, and so you can have an upward adjustment of the average weekly wage. I know that's starting to get a little complicated, but just know that your average weekly wage can change, and it can be upward adjusted if you're terminated and you lose your fringe benefits. So that is roughly, and then just to bring it to a conclusion here, that all that math that we talked about with the 13 weeks, and usually that's done on the form of what's called a 13-week wage statement. So you can Google that if you want to, Florida Workers' Comp 13-week wage statement. That's the paper that gets completed when you get hurt, and that's what represents what your average weekly wage is. Sometimes mistakes are made, and people will include the week of the accident, and it turns out that you made more money in a prior week than the week of the accident, but that's average weekly wage. Hope you liked the video. Please like and subscribe for more legal education videos like this. Thank you.